Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP U.S. History. As today, we talk about the aftermath of the election of 1800, an election described by the man who won it, Thomas Jefferson, as a revolution. Now, Thomas Jefferson was sworn in as president March 4th, 1801, and in his inaugural address, he tried to bring an end to the political fighting that had characterized the election of 1800, saying, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," and promising to protect the rights of political minorities. But despite this apparent spirit of conciliation, Jefferson later called his own election a revolution. Although, was it really? Because in terms of massive political upheaval, it was not really a revolution. The election was actually very close, just a few electoral votes coming between Jefferson and Adams. And of course, Jefferson himself was only chosen president by the House of Representatives, having tied with Aaron Burr, who was supposed to have been his vice president, and ended up that way, but again, only through the assistance of Alexander Hamilton, who hated Burr far more than he hated Jefferson. Furthermore, in terms of government officials, it was not really a revolution. While Jefferson had campaigned against Federalist corruption, he had not in fact removed many Federalists from office. Many of his own party felt betrayed, having hoped to get jobs for themselves. They said of the old Federalists, "Few die and none resign." Of course, for his cabinet, Jefferson appointed loyal Republicans. His old friend and ally, James Madison, became Secretary of State. His Secretary of the Treasury was Albert Gallatin, a Swiss immigrant who had served in the U.S. Senate for a time before they realized he had not lived in the U.S. for 9 years by that point, that being a requirement for the U.S. Senate. Leaving the Senate, he was elected to the House of Representatives, which has lower standards. And as Secretary of the Treasury, he was not necessarily that revolutionary either. For the most part, he continued the policies of Alexander Hamilton. He continued to pay off the national debt. He kept the existing tariffs on imports. Although there was some debate about the Bank of the United States, it was allowed to continue under its existing charter of 20 years dating to 1791. But the fact that few Federalists died and none resigned meant the most in the judicial branch, where, with the Judiciary Act of 1801, the Federalists who controlled Congress when Adams was president, in the last few days they were in power, created a number of new positions, 16 new positions in the judiciary, to which Adams appointed many judges, his so-called midnight judges, at the last minute. Of those midnight judges, whom the Jeffersonians particularly despised, was the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall. Now, the Republicans repealed the Judiciary Act of 1801 almost immediately, eliminating the positions of several of these new midnight judges outright, and of others, they tried to block them from taking office, including a man named William Marbury, who had been appointed Justice of the Peace for Washington, D.C., but had not yet received his commission. That was supposed at this point to be delivered by James Madison, the Secretary of State, but he refused to give Marbury his official orders to take office. Madison, in turn, did this at the orders of Thomas Jefferson. So Marbury sued, and it reached the Supreme Court in 1803, the case of Marbury versus Madison. And on the surface, this does not seem like a particularly important case. Marbury is a pretty minor official who vanishes from history after this, except this turned out to be a very important case. Now, the Supreme Court, including Chief Justice John Marshall, ruled against Marbury, despite him being a Federalist. The grounds for rejecting his plea was that Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789, which he based his case upon, was, Marshall said, unconstitutional. It attempted to give the Supreme Court powers the Constitution had not meant for it to have, possibly violating the very concept of separation of powers. Plus, although perhaps it went unspoken, Marshall didn't want to push Jefferson too far. But again, what matters was the court deciding that the law Marbury was trying to use was partly unconstitutional. And so this established the precedent of judicial review for the U.S. Supreme Court. This was a pretty new idea that had been developing amongst legal scholars the past couple of decades and had been applied in state courts to declare state laws unconstitutional a few times by this point. The Supreme Court had not done this before. Indeed, the U.S. Constitution does not say the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review, but also does not say it doesn't have that power. And Marshall saw this as an opportunity to make the federal government more powerful by establishing the power to declare laws, including local and state laws, unconstitutional. And it would make the judicial branch more powerful in general, helping perhaps to more clearly make it equal to the other two branches. Jeffersonians, though, wanted revenge and went after another justice of the Supreme Court, Samuel Chase, who was not particularly popular. One of his nicknames was Old Bacon Face. As a Federalist who was accused of basing his judgments on his political biases, Republicans even named their dogs after him. So when they were mad at their dog, they could kick Samuel Chase. And in 1804, the House of Representatives voted to impeach him from the Supreme Court. But the Senate, which must agree to remove someone from office, concluded that while he may have been biased, this did not go far enough to count as a high crime or a misdemeanor, which is what the Constitution requires for an impeachment. So Chase remained on the Supreme Court, the first and so far only justice to be impeached, and surviving the impeachment procedure helped to establish the independence and power of the judiciary. And yet, in some ways, Jefferson did have a revolution, certainly in terms of the customs of the presidency, which was very different than that of his predecessors, who had, in some ways, taken on the role of a monarch, even if they would have denied that in public. A role that Washington filled very effectively, that Adams filled somewhat ridiculously. Jefferson, though, as a democratical sort of leader, paid little attention to etiquette. Although at official dinners, he did in some ways entertain like an aristocrat, spending over $10,000 on wine alone during his presidency. People were seated democratically, being allowed to choose whatever seat you liked when you arrive, which may not seem like a big deal today, but in formal official circles, that was a very big deal. Government officials, especially foreign ambassadors and other foreigners, were accustomed to being seated according to rank. Even today, you can find a list of, say, which British members of the aristocracy are seated above others. The Archbishop of Canterbury, for example, outranks the Archbishop of York, who outranks Durham and Chester's bishops, who outrank all other bishops, and so forth. And each bishop falls above or below one lord or another. But not for Jefferson. First come, first served official dinners. Washington Adams had from time to time addressed Congress, as the Constitution does require the President to make reports to Congress of the sort we now call the State of the Union address. Jefferson, though, said that such an address was too much like the monarch speaking to Parliament. Plus, Jefferson was rather a shy public speaker and didn't want to have to do this anyway. So rather than address Congress in person, he sent an annual message, a tradition that would last for over a century. The Alien and Sedition Acts had expiration dates built in, largely to protect the Federalists who passed them from having them apply to them should they lose the next electoral campaign. He did keep the Alien Enemies Act intact. But the main thing was to allow immigrants to apply for citizenship once again after 5 years. And those who did apply were almost always granted citizenship and then almost always voted Republican. The unpopular excise tax on whiskey was eliminated. The Army was reduced to 2,500 men. And he reversed, eventually, the Federalist policy of building a strong Navy, preferring to build or maintain a fleet of small gunboats for coastal defense only. These small gunboats were nicknamed Jeffs after Jefferson, or called the Mosquito Fleet because they were so small. In one embarrassing case, one of them was picked up by a hurricane and dropped 8 miles inland in Georgia. Although he did not get to shrink the Navy at first, as we shall see. And yet, this was a revolution in another way as well. The greatest revolution of all, in fact, was the fact that it wasn't a revolution. It was a bloodless transfer of power from one faction to its opponents, when compared to the French Revolution going on at that time, or to many revolutions since. This was a great success, showing the stability and functionality of the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. government as a whole. Although Jefferson's victory in this Revolution of 1800 indirectly led to one of our first major foreign crises. Because when Thomas Jefferson was inaugurated in March of 1801, the Pasha of Tripoli in North Africa sent him a message saying that to celebrate his inauguration, Jefferson ought to give the Pasha a gift of $225,000 and an additional yearly tribute of $25,000, at a time when the entire U.S. budget was $10 million per year. Jefferson refused, and the Pasha had his men go to the U.S. consulate and chop down the flagpole bearing the American flag, which America treated as a declaration of war. And soon, the Dey of Algiers and the Bey of Tunis also declared war on the United States, beginning the First Barbary War in 1801. Indeed, since independence, one of the greatest threats to American shipping had been the Barbary States of North Africa, a series effectively of city-states. Most were technically provinces of the Ottoman Empire, but in general they could do pretty much whatever they liked as long as they recognized the Sultan as supreme and sent him taxes from time to time. And so what they did was work as pirates. These pirate kingdoms preyed on Mediterranean trade, even shipping in the Eastern Atlantic, sometimes raiding towns as far away from Iceland, and had done so since the 1500s. They seized ships, they seized goods, they seized treasure to pay their annual tribute to the Sultan in Constantinople, but the most prized loot of all were slaves. It's been estimated that between the 1500s and the early 1800s, up to 3 million Europeans and Americans were enslaved in North Africa. For the use of the pirates, often to resell or to be ransomed back. Indeed, individuals might be ransomed back by their families. Charities and governments set up funds to ransom Christian slaves back from the Barbary pirates. Another way that the Barbary states made money, rather than committing piracy, was through a protection racket. Annual tributes paid by various countries so that the pirates would not attack their ships. Now, during and right after the American Revolution, the United States had been under the protection of the French. Their tribute and their navy protected our merchant fleet. But when that alliance came to an end, America was on our own. And so the United States budget included an annual tribute to the Barbary States. By 1800, 1/5 of our entire budget went to pay off the Barbary pirates. But that wasn't enough. They asked for more, and war began. We did fortunately have a few of the warships the Federalists had built during the Quasi-War still around, and 4 warships, almost our entire Navy, were sent to the Mediterranean. Over the next 2 years, 12 more frigates, several smaller ships, were built and sent to fight the pirates too, despite Jefferson's wish to cut military spending, which he did once the war was over. Among the naval heroes of the war were William Bainbridge and Stephen Decatur, although in many ways the fighting was a draw. Indeed, America's greatest naval victory in the war was not actually a major defeat of any Barbary ship, but rather, after USS Philadelphia had been captured, Decatur went to try to get it back in a daring raid in the middle of the night. While he was able to reach the Philadelphia, He was not able to recapture it. Our victory, such as it was setting the ship on fire, so the Barbary pirates could not use it either. Still, U.S. Navy kept the Pasha of Tripoli's fleet trapped in Tripoli harbor, cutting off most of the income he had previously gotten from piracy. The Marines were sent to fight aboard our ships and ideally aboard the pirate ships, and also to land on the shores of Tripoli to capture the Tripolitan town of Derna near the city of Tripoli itself. An event commemorated in the Marine Corps hymn. The Marines also based their official dress sword on a sword given to one Marine officer at this time by an Egyptian mercenary fighting alongside them. And so, with this victory on the shores of Tripoli, and with the American blockade cutting off his income, the Pasha of Tripoli signed a peace treaty June 10, 1805. Still, Jefferson ended up paying a ransom of $60,000 for prisoners captured during the war, and afterwards began to shrink our Navy down to the Mosquito fleet he felt more appropriate to a republic. And there were some American officers who felt paying a ransom was dishonorable after the Marines' victory, but most Americans were happy the war was over. Most of the world did view it as an American victory, although within 2 years, the Day of Algiers was attacking American ships again. And finally, in 1815, we'd really had enough, and along with the British and Dutch, went to war with Algiers, and later Tripoli and Tunis, in the Second Barbary War, a clear American victory, seriously weakening the Barbary pirates. Over the next 10 or 15 years, the British and French would come and mop things up. By 1830, France controlled most of North Africa, and the Barbary threat was done for good. Jefferson faced another foreign threat to domestic security on our western border in Louisiana. And so this threatened the western farmers who were among his strongest supporters. Now, Louisiana belonged to Spain when Jefferson became president, France having given it to Spain after the French and Indian War. But now, as Napoleon's power grew in Europe, he told Spain they had better give Louisiana back, or he'd just come and take over Spain. Spain agreed to give Louisiana back, although a few years later, Napoleon came and took over Spain anyway, setting up his brother as king of Spain. And his brother's policies would so infuriate some Spanish colonists in the New World that this would provoke wars of independence in almost all of Spain's New World colonies. So, this was a threat to America too. Jefferson had not worried much about Spain, but he didn't want Napoleon in America's backyard. Indeed, in territory he envisioned the U.S. eventually overrunning anyway. So in 1803, as the process of transferring Louisiana from Spain to France was going on, Jefferson sent James Monroe to Paris to meet up with the current American ambassador there, Robert Livingston, with the authority to offer up to $10 million just for the city of New Orleans, a valuable port through which most Western trade ended up passing, except that Spain had once again placed limits on that trade as they prepared to hand Louisiana over to France. And Monroe had authority further, if France did not accept this offer, to form an alliance with Britain against France. So while Jefferson may have hated Britain, he needed New Orleans more. Fortunately, Louisiana was becoming less appealing to Napoleon. Because Napoleon faced, as earlier French leaders had been facing since 1794, a slave revolt in Haiti, one going very well for the rebellious slaves. Originally led by Francois Toussaint Louverture, although he was eventually captured by the French and died in a French prison. The slaves of Haiti had successfully killed most of the white French people there, and besides their own military successes, the French were also being defeated by the thousands by mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever. And with it clear that Haiti could not be retaken, and indeed would become an independent republic in 1804, the second republic in the Western Hemisphere, Napoleon decided he'd had enough. And if Napoleon couldn't keep the sugar plantations of Haiti, he didn't really need Louisiana to feed those plantations. Besides, this was a huge territory overseas that could be vulnerable if he went back to war with Britain, as he was planning to do very soon. Instead, he needs not land, but money. And so, while Livingston was waiting for Monroe to show up in France, he still tried to negotiate trading privileges in New Orleans, and Napoleon went ahead and offered him not just privileges, not just New Orleans itself, but the whole thing, all of Louisiana, for $15 million, an offer Livingston could not refuse. Nor could Jefferson. Jefferson was thrilled by this deal, but horrified too. He had not expected to get so much so quickly, and he wasn't sure that the executive's diplomatic power went so far as to buy this vast stretch of real estate. That's a real philosophical problem for Jefferson, as he's a strict constructionist. If the Constitution doesn't say you can do it, then you probably can't. Man, this is such a good deal. Louisiana's too valuable to let go, and Jefferson feared if he didn't act quickly, Napoleon might change his mind. And so, even though he thought it might be unconstitutional to do so, he agreed to buy Louisiana, and then submitted the treaties to the Senate, which must approve treaties. The Senate, in turn, concluded that it was necessary and proper to purchase Louisiana, stretching the elastic clause wide enough to fit Louisiana through, buying 828,000 square miles for the price of about 3 cents an acre. And even if Jefferson said he disapproved of this philosophically and constitutionally, the fact is he was enthusiastic about creating an empire of liberty to stretch across North America. Indeed, he assumed that this would happen naturally, that the American Indians would simply vanish on their own, and that the United States would ultimately overwhelm the declining monarchies of Europe and occupy their territories as well. So even before beginning negotiations to buy Louisiana, he had begun planning an expedition to explore the interior of North America, because we really didn't know what was out there in and beyond what was called the Great American Desert. He hoped American yeoman farmers would expand into the area, and he really hoped that the Missouri River, that great waterway running into the Mississippi, would somewhere in the interior of the continent, the unexplored, unknown regions within, link up with the Columbia River, that mighty river on the Pacific coast, and that would make it possible to sail from Pittsburgh to the Pacific Ocean, that long dreamed for all-water route to Asia. And so, to explore this territory, he formed the Corps of Discovery, led by his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and Army officer William Clark. Along the way, they were helped by a French fur trader and by his Indian wife, Sacagawea. They led the way. Sacagawea helped to translate between them and Indian groups they met on the way, for the most part getting along with the Indians they met. And in one case, too amazing for anyone to dare make it a fictional story because it wouldn't be believed, as they did encounter a very hostile tribe, clearly poised to attack them, and they latched this effort to save themselves. Lewis and Clark brought out Sacagawea to try to negotiate with the tribal leaders, only to discover that their leader was her long-lost brother, she having been kidnapped by another Indian tribe when she was younger. And, of course, they reunited joyfully, and there was no way her brother could attack her and her friends. In the summer of 1805, Lewis and Clark discovered perhaps the greatest disappointment in American history and geography, the Rocky Mountains, which indeed make it impossible to sail from Pittsburgh to the Pacific Ocean. They did reach the Pacific Ocean, laying an American claim to the territory referred to as Oregon. All the Oregon country was claimed by not only the U.S. now, but also by the British, by Spain, dating all the way back to the Treaty of Tordesillas, and by Russia, whose empire was spreading down the northwestern coast of North America through Russian Alaska. And all four countries would claim this area, but not push too hard at this time. And Lewis and Clark were not our only great explorers. Zebulon Pike, a lieutenant in the U.S. Army, in 1805 and 1806, led an expedition across the Southwest into what are now Colorado and New Mexico, which were then Spanish territory. Indeed, he was captured by the Spanish in what is now Mexico, and escorted back to the United States along with his men. On his expedition, he saw, but did not actually visit, the mountain now named Pikes Peak in his honor, and scouted out a large portion of the Southwest. Indeed, some have suggested his capture by the Spanish might not have been an accident, as it let him see even more Spanish territory while being escorted through Mexico as a prisoner. Some have even argued his expedition was ordered in part by higher-ranking Army officers who hoped to invade Mexico, either on behalf of the U.S. or to seize for themselves. Indeed, this huge, barely settled Western territory was not an unmitigated blessing. The framers of the Constitution had feared that without a strong central government, America might split into regional confederacies, perhaps even rival, even enemy countries, which today seems unrealistic, an unfounded fear. But in fact, there were several conspiracies to do just that in the 1780s and 1790s. In the 1780s, Revolutionary War veteran James Wilkinson, who had left the Army for the moment and moved to Kentucky, accepted cash payments from the Spanish government to encourage Kentucky and other Westerners to declare independence from the United States and join the Spanish Empire. Although that was unsuccessful in and of itself, Wilkinson remained a paid agent of the Spanish crown, agent number 13, for years and years, even once he returned to the Army and rose to the rank of commanding general of the United States Army. He remained an agent of Spain. In what is now East Tennessee, Spain sent money to leaders of the state of Franklin in hopes of pulling it into the Spanish Empire. As far as I can tell, John Sevier took the Spanish silver and spent it as he pleased and had no interest in actually joining Spain. But Spain's influence was so great that what is now Middle Tennessee was for several years known as the Miro District, not after any American or some local geographic feature, but after the Spanish governor of Louisiana, Esteban Rodriguez Miro. After Tennessee became a state and sent the former territorial governor, William Blount, to the U.S. Senate as one of our first two senators, he conspired with the British in 1797 to seize West Florida from Spain, in exchange for his own land claims there being recognized and Britain opening the Mississippi to American trade. This was eventually discovered, and the Senate began impeachment hearings against Blount. During the hearings, a fight broke out on the floor of Congress between Matthew Lyon, a Republican from Vermont, and Roger Griswold, a Federalist from Connecticut, during which Lyon spit in Griswold's face, earning them an investigation for violating the Senate rules and getting Lyon a nickname, the Spitting Lion. And so Blount, from Tennessee, became the first senator to be impeached, or at least for the Senate to try to impeach. He actually fled to his home in Knoxville, refused to attend the hearings, even when the sergeant of arms from the Senate went to Knoxville to try to compel him to attend. Although in the end, the Senate decided they could not actually impeach one of their members, but instead concluded they did have the power to expel a senator, and likewise the House of Representatives could not impeach, but could expel their own members. And so Blount was expelled, although he viewed it as having resigned before this could take place, and the people of Tennessee apparently did not mind. he was elected to the Tennessee State Senate, where he served until his death in 1800, just a couple years later. Far from the frontier, in New England and New York, Vice President Aaron Burr became involved in a plot by some New England and New York Federalists to break away from the Union in response to Jefferson's purchase of Louisiana, which they feared would further diminish the influence of their region and their increasingly regional party. Part of the plot was to arrange for Burr to be elected governor of New York in 1804. As governor of New York, he could lead New York and New England out of the Union. Burr was not elected, in large part due to the influence of Alexander Hamilton, who no longer holds any official office, but was still very influential in the New York Federalist Party. With Burr failing to be elected, this plot collapsed, although things don't work out that great for Hamilton either. Burr accused Hamilton, a long-standing rival politically, in business, in personal life, accused him of spreading nasty rumors about Burr. Hamilton refused to apologize. He claimed not to have taken part in certain specific acts of slandering Burr, and said he could not apologize for something he had not done, although he didn't rule out having broadly spoken ill of Burr. Burr responded as a gentleman must when he is offended, and challenged Hamilton to a duel, which by this point was illegal in New York, so he went across the river to New Jersey. Now, when we imagine a duel today, we tend to think of it as shown in movies. The two men stand back to back, walk some paces apart, turn, and fire at one another. And maybe that was done some places, but in America, as in Britain, we followed the Code Duello, defined in Ireland in the early 1700s, in which case the two duelists, or principals, stood on marks a set distance apart. When given a signal, each would take one shot at the other, and possibly a second shot, depending on the circumstances, if neither was hit the first time. Now, Hamilton had said in advance that he planned to throw away his shot, meaning to fire it up in the air or down into the ground where it could do no harm. The Code Duello said you shouldn't do this. If you were going to duel, you ought to do it for real and try to shoot the other guy. But some people were coming to view dueling as possibly immoral. Maybe you shouldn't shoot somebody else just because he offended your honor. So some people did throw their shots away. Hamilton said he would. Burr made no such promises. And we're not entirely sure what happened, because with dueling becoming a bit legally questionable, in some places, including here, the seconds and other people there to assist with the duel would be small in number and would turn their backs right before firing began, so you could afterwards say, well, I didn't see anything. Both men fired a shot. They later found a chunk shot out of a branch above Burr's head. So maybe Hamilton fired his shot wildly. Maybe he did try to shoot Burr and missed. Maybe he really was throwing his shot away, but uncomfortably close to Burr. Burr shot Hamilton. The ball hit him in the hip. It bounced around inside his lower abdomen, a wound from which he died the next day. July 12th, 1804. Burr was rapidly escorted away. One of his friends held an umbrella between him and Hamilton, so even if Hamilton were to die, although again he didn't die till the next day, Burr could claim he had not actually seen Hamilton die. Nonetheless, Vice President Burr was charged with murder under New York's laws, although it never went to trial. He went back to Washington, D.C., served out the rest of his term as vice president, but was not invited to serve a second term as Jefferson's vice president when he was reelected. So, out of office in 1805, Burr made plans to move to Mexico, where the Spanish government had granted him some land. He also began making plans with General James Wilkinson, by now governor of the Louisiana Territory, and some others, to raise an army and conquer Mexico, or at least some parts of it, like Texas, and also to seize New Orleans and some or all of the rest of Louisiana, to create their own empire between the U.S. and Spanish territory. Eventually, Jefferson found out about this conspiracy, and Wilkinson, always kind of slimy, turned on Burr. And Burr was accused of treason and put on trial. But while many Westerners testified against Burr, and many testified for him, the Constitution requires 2 witnesses to a specific treasonable act for someone to be convicted of treason. And so while Chief Justice John Marshall was under a lot of pressure to convict Burr, ultimately Burr was found not guilty. From there, Burr fled to Europe and eventually tried to convince Napoleon to invade America and conquer Florida. Indeed, the Napoleonic Wars continued to draw America into conflict between Britain and France. In particular, in 1807, Britain passed the Orders in Council. Now, I should state that Orders in Council are a type of British law, and there are many Orders in Council in British history, I'm sure. In American history, only this one set in 1807 are important. And these Orders in Council required that all neutral ships, including American ships, traveling to Europe must first dock in Britain to be inspected. In return, Napoleon declared that any ship that entered a British port would be seized by the French. So, if we sail straight to Europe, the British may seize our ships. If we stop in Britain first, Napoleon may seize our ships. Either way, interfering with America's freedom of the seas, the right of a neutral power, especially if it's us, to trade with and travel wherever we like. And, even worse, was Britain's continuing impressment of American sailors, stopping American merchant ships and seizing sailors whom they claimed had been born in Britain, arguing that anyone born a British subject was always a subject and subject to impressment. Because the British did this to sailors on their own merchant ships, other countries did the same sort of thing, in effectively drafting experienced sailors for the British Navy. Now, British warships again stopped American ships. It's been estimated at least 10,000 U.S. citizens were impressed by the Royal Navy because British-born people might become American citizens, but the British did not recognize that. And anyway, it was awfully hard to prove. Even if you were born in America as a natural-born citizen, it could be hard to prove that. After all, we all spoke English. In 1807, the British went even further, as the warship HMS Leopard stopped an American warship, USS Chesapeake, off the coast of Virginia, and demanded the captain of the Chesapeake turn over 4 British-born sailors who had deserted from the Royal Navy. This was not so hard to work out because one of them had a habit of bragging in port how he had deserted from the Royal Navy. 3 of those 4 sailors had, by the way, become American citizens since deserting the British Navy. So the American captain refused to turn over his sailors. The captain of the Leopard ordered an attack on the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake was forced to surrender after 3 men were killed and 18 wounded, including the captain. The 4 deserters were then seized. The 3 who had become American citizens were given 500 lashes. And the one still a full British subject was hanged. Those 3 who were lashed were eventually returned. Now, Britain admitted their captain had gone too far in the Chesapeake affair, and Americans were furious. But Jefferson refused to go to war, both out of the principle that a republic should not get involved in foreign wars, and out of recognition that the U.S. Navy was far too weak to fight the British or the French. Still, the Chesapeake affair angered many Americans, and Republicans in particular felt the U.S. maybe did need to build a stronger Navy after all, and that war with Britain might be inevitable. And also, when many Federalists who were closely connected with British trade seemed willing to forget the Chesapeake affair too quickly, some Republicans came to see them as traitors. But some response was necessary. And Jefferson and Madison believed that Britain's economy, though seemingly strong, was actually very fragile and dependent on American trade. They felt that American trade was very important to France, too, and that economic warfare could bring an end to this crisis. And so, in 1807, they convinced Congress to pass the Embargo Act, cutting off all American trade with the world, along with some other acts later that year in 1808 to further enforce the embargo. They assumed that American trade was so important to Britain and France that their economies would begin to crumble and they would have to give in to our demands and recognize our freedom of the seas. In fact, while British trade with America was important to Britain, and American trade mattered a bit to France, the fact is they both had other people to trade with, but British trade accounted for the vast majority of America's trade outside the U.S. And this hurt America far more than it hurt Britain or certainly France. American trade declined by 75 or 80%. It particularly hurt the Federalists of New England, who had the most manufacturing and the most trade with Britain. And some did talk about leaving the Union. Smuggling increased across the Canadian border enormously. Although Southerners, who counted on exporting cotton and rice and tobacco, were also hurt by this. The embargo was very unpopular across the country. Even some Jeffersonian Republicans turned back into Federalists. People cursed the embargo, giving it nicknames like "Oh, grab me," embargo spelt backwards, as seen in his famous cartoon, although I'm not certain that this cartoon itself is actually an anti-embargo cartoon. Indeed, there we see the embargo, the American snapping turtle, catching someone trying to sell, probably to smuggle, superfine American goods to a British ship there in the back corner. So this cartoon, I think, may be supportive of the embargo, but certainly many people were not. And there was an interesting and unintended side effect of this embargo. As Americans lost access to British manufactured goods, we were forced to produce our own to compensate for what we couldn't get from Britain. And so, the agrarian Jefferson, who distrusted manufacturing and commerce and loved the independent yeoman farmer, ended up doing far more to promote our infant industries, especially in New England, than the high Federalist Hamilton had ever managed to do. And so as the economy declined and New England spoke of secession, Jefferson admitted he felt the foundations of government tremble under his feet. And 3 days before he left office, Congress did repeal the Embargo Act, March 1st, 1809, while they replaced it with the Non-Intercourse Act, which still banned trade with Britain and France. It did permit trade with other countries, but Britain was by far our most important trading partner, France a distant second, and both of them continued to harass American shipping. Again, that was just before the end of his presidency. Thomas Jefferson in 1808, like Washington before him, decided 2 terms was enough, chose not to seek a 3rd term, and retired to Monticello, his plantation in Virginia. But successfully supported his Secretary of State, James Madison, to follow him as our 4th president.